Well, hello, my name's Carl Brown, and I am the worship pastor at North Highlands Baptist. And we're so glad that you could join us today. I'm out here in my gazebo in my yard again, and we're just here for another backyard Bible study. I'm glad you're here to join us. Let's get into the Word. Tonight we're going to be in Exodus. The first 5 chapters of Exodus is what our reading assignment was this week. And so from the first 5 chapters of Exodus, I've kind of got a Bible study for us to go through tonight. And there's just so much to say about Exodus. It really introduces us to several things. One of the things it introduces us to is Moses. Moses, one of the greatest biblical characters and one of the greatest men in the history of the planet. Moses, just phenomenal leader that led the people of Israel. And it also introduces us to the people of Israel instead of just the sons and daughters and grandchildren of Israel. We finally get into the story of the people Israel, or as they're called several times in Exodus, the Hebrews. Now before, and all through Genesis, as they were developing, as they started with Abraham, we had Abraham, and then we had Abraham's son, Isaac, and they weren't really a people yet. They were just a family. Abraham, Isaac, and then Isaac had a son, Jacob. And now Jacob was also called Israel by the Lord, and that's where we get the name of the country, where we get the name of the people, Israel. They are all named after Jacob, or as God renamed them, Israel. And so Israel had 12 children, and all those children moved to Egypt. Joseph was one of those children. He was the second in command of Egypt, and so they all moved down there, and we read all that in the end of Genesis. It's a great story about Joseph and how he moved his entire family down there with him, all the children of Israel. And now all the children of Israel were given the land down there, and they lived down there through the life of Joseph, and after Joseph, Joseph's kids and all of his brothers' kids just kept living there, being shepherds and multiplying and growing greater and greater in number. And so they became a nation. I guess that happens when you have 12 kids. You can become a nation over 100 or so years. So introduces us to them, and it gives us the history of this great nation. A nation, Israel, that helped change the entire world with its morality, with its rules, with its conquest, with its history. It helped change and shape the world we're living in today. So it's an incredible thing to get into Exodus, because Exodus is going to give us all that history about Israel, the children of Israel, but the nation of Israel as it's grown to be right when we get started in Exodus. And the main thing, though, is all of Exodus is written by Moses. Genesis was written by Moses, too. Exodus, all of the law, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, first 5 books, were all written by Moses. He was a very educated man. And but this right here, kind of his story, Exodus, was a first-hand account of what happened. It's kind of an autobiography in many ways, and a biography of the Israel nation in other ways. So it's just a rich book, and that I hope you are taking your time to look at and to read. But we get the backstory of Moses here just in the first couple of chapters, and it really teaches us a lot about God, because God is going to use Moses here. Right at the beginning of the book of Exodus, we're going to see that God has a plan. Now, here's what happens in chapter 1. Just to sum up, chapter 1 starts with the children of Israel growing numerous as a nation, and a new Pharaoh coming into power who didn't know anything about Joseph or his great reputation. History tells us that it was about 175 to 200 years after the life of Joseph, this king came into power. Didn't know anything about Joseph, didn't care anything about Joseph, and all he saw was that the Israelites had grown great in number, and he was afraid. He was afraid that if there was ever a war, that they would join their adversaries, and they would take over all of Egypt. And he didn't want that to happen. And so he made the decision to enslave the Israelites. And so that's when it started. This new Pharaoh put the Israelites, enslaved them, and made them do all their farming, and made them do all their building. Now, as we know from what we see today, just the remnants of the great kingdom of Egypt, the building was phenomenal. All the city and all the things that held the tombs of the pharaohs and the Sphinx and all these other things. It says here in the first chapter of Exodus that they had built 2 whole cities as supply cities and all these things, but just that their life was ruled by the Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And it says that they ruled over them ruthlessly, that they were mean to them, that they were harsh slave owners. Kind of reminds me of what we had to deal with here in our country 200 years ago, 150 years ago. All the slave ownership in America was not something that was really akin to some of the slave ownership in the New Testament. It was more like this. It was harsh. It was ruthless. It was wrong. And the cry of the people really went up to the Lord, and he was ready to deliver them. So Pharaoh, seeing that they had grown so many, decides to do some population planning. And he goes and he talks to the midwives, and he wants them to kill all the boy children that are born. Let the girls live, but kill all the boy children, because he was worried about the men rising up and being an army. Well, the midwives didn't do that, and he realized that they didn't do that, and so he then just decided to flat out murder them. Had his soldiers come in, and every boy child that was born, they were just going to kill them. And so they did. They just killed all the boy children of the Israelites, again trying to control their population. Is a terrible, wicked thing. And in that moment, when their outcry was the greatest, when their slaves their slave masters were just terrible on them, and when their children were being slaughtered, that's where Moses enters into the story. And that's also where we start to see the beginning of God's plan for his people, and more importantly, God's plan for Moses, and hopefully by the end of our study today, God's plan for you and for me, and how he works in our lives. All right, well, the first thing I want you to see is that God protected Moses. And we're going to look at, and we're going to read just the first few verses of the first chapter of Exodus, and chapter 2 of Exodus, and see what happened at the very beginning of Moses' life. So here we go. Chapter 2, verse 1 says, "And a man of the house of Levi went and took his wife, a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, dabbed it with asphalt and pitch, and put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the riverbank. And his sisters stood afar off to know what would be done to him. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, 'This is one of the Hebrews' children.' Then his sister said to Pharaoh, the daughter, 'Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?' And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Go.' So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages.' So the woman took the child and nursed him, and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, saying, 'Because I drew him out of water.'" All right, first 10 verses of chapter 2 of Exodus tell us a lot about what's happening here. But the one thing that we see from God and his plan for Moses is the first thing he did is he protected Moses, that he really protected him. And I love how he did it. The very first thing that he did is he made him a beautiful baby. And I think that's neat because the mom looked at him, and of course, every mother probably thinks their children are beautiful. Now, I'm a minister, and I've seen lots of babies right after they were born, and I'm a father, and I've had 3 children, and quite frankly, I know most people think all babies are beautiful. They're just not. Some of them are just not pretty. Some of them, you get the baby, and you're like, whoa, oh my, how wonderful this child is. You know, you just have to think of something to say, but some are just born beautiful, and they just make you smile immediately when you see them. And apparently Moses was that kind of baby. He was a beautiful baby, and that stirred his mama's heart, and she hid him for 3 months. Now, when she couldn't do it anymore, God protected him again by giving him a clever mother who made this little ark, if you will, made this little float out of bushes and tar, and set it free in the Nile. Now, the Nile is a big river, and it had all kinds of traffic on it and had all kinds of things going on. But she set this baby free. You know, it had crocodiles, it had all kinds of things in the Nile. But she set the baby free in the Nile and just trusted God. So she was a clever mother, and she had faith in her God that he would take care of this baby. So she set it free. And then he had a clever sister. Another way he was cared for. His clever sister followed along. She was curious. She was clever. She was caring for the child. She wanted to make sure he was taken care of, and, you know, probably sad in that situation. But she followed along. And then just the circumstances get crazy. That God also protected Moses by, at that very minute, could have been any time of day, could have been any other circumstance. But at this particular moment, Pharaoh's daughter was bathing in the Nile, and he happened to come by at exactly the right time, and she rescued the child, and then he wept, and she had compassion on him. He protected Moses with the compassion of Pharaoh's daughter, and then his clever sister, and then he was raised by his own mother. So God had there are too many circumstances there to say that it wasn't part of God's plan. God's plan was to protect Moses, and he orchestrated all of that. So not only would he be protected indefinitely because he's under the protection of the Pharaoh's daughter, but also nurtured by his mother and raised for a time by his mother in his own culture, in his own faith. So that's really a beautiful thing. So God protected him. And then he separated them. And he separated them from the slaves, separated them from his people, just to protect them again, because they were ruthlessly ruling over the Israelites. So God protects. And so God protected Moses, and that was a great thing. The second way that God really intervened and made this part of his plan is he prepared Moses. He really took the time to prepare Moses. And when I say he took the time, I mean he took the time and he used everything in Moses' life to prepare him for the great man that we know now. Let's look at some of that. The first thing we know is in chapter 2, verse 11, the very next verse. It says, "Now it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, that he went out to his brethren, and he looked at their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren." Now just look at the first part of that. When he was grown. Now there are many things that are covered in the first half of a sentence. But Acts 7 tells us more about his growing up. And Josephus, the historian from antiquity, also gives us more information about that one bit of time when Moses grew. According to Josephus and according to the tradition at the time, he was with his mother almost to the age of 12, and then he was turned over to the Pharaoh's daughter, and then he was raised as a prince. And it says in Acts chapter 7:22 that he did mighty in works and in deeds. Josephus tells us that Moses was the head of an army and had defeated the Ethiopians. All this happened while he was in the household of the Pharaoh, being raised as royalty to lead the people. That's an amazing thing. So that lasts until he's about 40 years old. So from 0 to 40, we're already at 40 years old for Moses. And then he goes out there in verse 11 and he looks at their burdens, and he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. Now, God was preparing him. For one, he prepared him by educating him. That was a rare thing in those days. He was educated and trained to be a leader, and showed great intelligence, and did great works, and had great speech. All that happened in his education that he got from being raised as a child of the daughter of Pharaoh. And so that was a beautiful thing. He also prepared him because he knew his people. He didn't just abandon his people. He knew who his people were. He knew he was a Hebrew. He knew he was one of the Israelites. And so he knew about them. And then he gave them something else, this great character trait where he was morally brave. Morally brave. Now, I made that up, but that's what I think this is. He sees somebody who is being treated with injustice, and he wants justice to be done. And so his innate morality tells him there's a right and there's a wrong, and he tries to get in there and make things right. Now, he goes too far, and he kills this man. And so God prepared him by making him a lover of justice, making him morally brave, and also gave him a heart of compassion. He had compassion on this Israelite that was being beaten, but he took it too far. He killed the man, and became a murderer, became an outcast, became a foreigner. He had to leave. He had to run, a man on the run, an outlaw. And so he did. He left. And this is all part of God's plan. When he was 40 years old, he left, and he went to Midian, which is across the desert, and close to Mount Sinai. Went across the desert, and he gets there. And when he gets across the desert, and he's been truly humbled, he went from being a prince, like a king, leader of men, to being an outlaw, an outcast, and now abandoned and all alone, and has nothing to his name, and is being sought after by the most powerful man in the world at the time. So he was humbled. And he comes to Midian, and when he comes to Midian, he just can't help himself. These daughters of a priest were getting water for their animals, and these shepherds came in and they were harassing them. In kicks his moral justice again, and this moral bravery he has, and he chases them all away. I mean, I don't even know what was involved with that, but it was one against many, and he was able to get them to stop bothering him, and then he helped the ladies. So again, he had compassion, he had a sense of justice, he had a morality that was instilled in him, and God was using these events to help shape the man that he was going to be. And so he was called in. We see in chapter 2 that he was called in by Jethro, or Reuel, your Bible may say, the father of these young ladies who were feeding their animals, these 7 daughters. And he ends up taking one of them as his wife, having a couple of children, and living there as a shepherd for 40 years. All right, now that's a lot. That's a lot to take in. This is a lot of preparation. But do you know what it means for an Egyptian who was a ruler to become a shepherd? In those days, it was very clear that the shepherd were the very bottom of the status symbol. They were considered filthy people, just uneducated, and anybody, I guess, could be a shepherd. And so they were just the outcast, really, of the society. And matter of fact, that's why Pharaoh, when they settled, Joseph said, well, let us settle over here on the other side of the river, because we're shepherds and we know that y'all don't like shepherds. So here, Moses went from being a leader and a prince to being a shepherd. And he was humbled. He was humbled by that. He was broken by that. And it ended up becoming his life for 40 years. So he embraced it. But what does being a shepherd teach you? Being a shepherd is a very unique thing. Often pastors are called shepherds because they are actually leading people. They're leading them the way they should go to the Word of God, the way they should live their lives. Well, sheep are pretty dumb from what I've been told. And they do. They need someone to lead them to the pasture to eat the right kind of grass, lead them to the water, protect them. They have absolutely nothing to protect them. And so that's what Moses did for 40 years. He learned to shepherd these sheep and was raising a family. And shepherding teaches you all kinds of patience. And so he was getting that. And at the same time, he was being raised by he was under the tutelage and in the home of a priest and learning all he could from him. So Jethro was his teacher, his mom was his teacher, he was educated by Pharaoh's scholars. So now for almost 80 years, God has prepared Moses for his part in God's plan. And he had prepared his character. He had given his character humility, morality, bravery, patience, leadership. He had given him everything. The one thing that Moses didn't have at this point that we can tell is faith. God pursued Moses. Looking again in verse 2 of chapter 3, Moses was up on the mountain tending the sheep. And an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame and a fire in the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. So when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not draw near for this place. Take your sandals off, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. So at 80 years old, God pursues the faith of Moses. And he appears to him in a burning bush. And then they proceed to have a conversation. And in this conversation, God talks about his people and how they're in bondage and how he wants to help them out and how he's going to use Moses to do it and all the miraculous things he's going to do. But Moses was still having trouble with his faith. So God gave him a sign and some miraculous signs. In chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, Moses answered and said, But suppose they will not believe me or listen to my voice. Suppose they say, The Lord has not appeared to you. So the Lord said to him, What is that in your hand? He said, A rod. And he said, Cast it on the ground. So he cast it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses fled from it. See, I told you he was smart. He fled from that serpent. And then God tells him to pick it back up, and it becomes a rod again. And then God shows him where he put his hand in his vest, and he pulls it out, and it's covered in leprosy, and puts it back, and it's clean as baby skin. And God gives him these signs to help him with his faith. I just think it's really important that we realize that God met Moses where he was. He met him where he was, not just physically, but he did meet him there physically where he was, but he also met him there spiritually. He knew that he needed faith, and so he gave him signs and helped him in his faith. He met him mentally. He had all these questions. He had and concerns, and God had a conversation with him, and he wasn't daunted by Moses' questions at all, and explained things to him. And then he met him emotionally where he was. He was afraid, he was scared and insecure, and so God helped provide even in that, which is really the next thing that we want to get to. What Moses needed was faith and confidence. And God gave him that faith and confidence. He provided things that would help him get that faith and confidence. That's the next thing we want to talk about. God also provided for Moses as part of his plan for his life. So far we've had God protected him, he prepared him, he pursued him, and now we see that he provided for him what he needed to accomplish God's plan for his life. How did God provide for him? Well, God provided miracles to help him with his faith. But when he was saying that he couldn't speak and that didn't feel like he was confident in his speak, he provided Aaron to help him in his confidence. And not only that, he gave him a staff that he could hold on to, even though it wasn't needed, a staff that he could hold on to when he was insecure for a little bit of security and power. And then he gave him himself for power, authority, and for wisdom. That's right. God gave himself to Moses. He made sure that Moses knew that he wasn't going to be alone. Let's look in chapter 3, verse 12. It says here, God said, so he said, I will certainly be with you. Let's look again in chapter 4, also verse 12. Now therefore go, and I will be with you, your mouth, and teach you what you should say. God never planned on preparing Moses, giving him these different tools, and then sending him on his way. God planned on being with him every step of the way to accomplish God's plan. And I think this brings us to some of our biggest points from Exodus chapters 1 through 4 so far, is that you are never alone. God is with you. God's not going to equip you and prepare you for something and then just leave you out hanging on your own to accomplish it. No, he promises that we are not made to do it on our own. What God did in the life of Moses is he used every bit of his experience that he had, all that he'd given him for 80 years of his life. He used all of that experience as the clay to mold him into the vessel that he could use. And that's what he wants to do. He wants to use it. He doesn't want to just make a vessel and deploy it or give it away. He's going to use that vessel to accomplish his plan. And so I think that we can all take something from this. One of the things we have to take from this is God has a plan for us too, just like he had for Moses. But God uses everything that's happened in our life, all the things that we're going through, all those things are part of his plan and part of his preparation for what he wants us to be able to accomplish now, not by ourselves, but with him. He is with us. And it says that he's going to do more than just be here at our side, that he's going to teach us and he's going to lead us, that we can get wisdom from him and he can direct us in the way that we should go. I love Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. It speaks to this. We spoke a bit last week when I talked about life verses that we have memorized, but it's so appropriate. I'll share it again. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not in your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he'll direct your paths. That is a promise that if we acknowledge God, if we surrender to God, if we follow him, if we study his word and try to live by it, that he will direct our paths. He will help us to accomplish his plan. And that brings me to my last point. God's plan is going to prevail. He prevails. He accomplished his goal through Moses. And if Moses had jumped ship and absolutely said not, God was still going to accomplish his plan. But how much better it was for Moses that he surrendered to the will of God, and it was through him. How much better for us is it when God has a task for us to do, when God has a plan for our lives, a ministry for us to accomplish, when we allow God to use our experience and use our talents and the gifts he's given us to accomplish his plan, instead of rejecting him, being selfish, and God having to go around us to accomplish it. God's going to prevail. God's will be done. And I want it to be done in my life, as well as those around me, as well as I want it done in your life. So what did God do for Moses here in this great backstory of the Israelites? We see that God protected him. We see that he prepared him for 80 years. He prepared him for the journey that he was going to take as an 80-year-old. Let's not talk much about retirement now. At 80 years old, God called him into his ministry. God pursued him in his faith. and God provided what he needed, namely himself, for him to accomplish the task, and God prevailed. These are great lessons. So after this, in chapter 4, chapter 5, we see that Moses does go back to Egypt. And in Egypt, he comes in, meets with the Pharaoh, and then we have a very interesting time in history that happens in that period of time when Moses and Pharaoh are confronting each other, and he's asking them to let God's people go. It's going to be a great time of study next week. Next week is also Holy Week. It's also the week before Easter, the greatest day on our Christian calendar. And I think that there are some lessons or some things for us to learn from the next few chapters of Exodus that go right in hand with Holy Week. So I hope you'll read ahead. If you haven't read it already, read chapter 5 and then read chapters 6 through 12 of Exodus this week to be ready for next week as we go through the 10 plagues that happened in Egypt. God bless you. I'm glad that you're here with us today. I just want you to take one thing with you today. I want you to know that God is going to use everything that's happening to you in your life, every good thing, every bad thing. He will use it all because his favorite thing to do is to take a broken vessel and to use it for his will. And I know he has a plan for you. I know he loves you, and I know he is with you and will never forsake you. Let's pray. Dear Lord, thank you for this lesson. Thank you for the life of Moses, this great Christian leader from the Old Testament. Lord, the things that we learn from his experience, his time, Lord, may we apply it to our lives. May we have faith. Lord, may we seek you with all that we are. In your most holy name we pray. Amen.